All right, if I could call us back into order so that we can begin the special meeting. If the authority members would please take their seats. Yeah, I know. Conceptually a good idea. All right, so I'd like to welcome everyone back and want to thank you for selecting me as the chair of these special meetings, and we'll see whether you and I are all thanking each other at the end of this meeting. The first item on our agenda is public comment. This is for comment on items that are not on this agenda. Is there any, you will be able to comment on the agenda items as we go through them. Is there any public comment at this point? Seeing none. Then the next item is item D, the approval of the minutes from our special meeting of January 6th.
Move approval. Second.
There's a motion by Commissioner Pierce, second by Commissioner Taylor, with a comment by Commissioner Arnerich.
You know, just an observation that don't normally comment on this. All of our other meeting minutes have commissioner comments, and these don't. So it has staff and it has the public. But I mean, it's just in the minutes, nothing is about what we have said.
Okay.
It would seem that all of our meetings, even the minutes we already approved, had our comments. It just seemed like, did we miss that? Or because I would hope that we would want to put those comments in because we were listening and trying to get back a response and a direction. So, or am I missing something?
We can take that as direction.
Okay.
All right. I will. I haven't gotten it. Yeah. Okay. There's a motion and a second to approve the January 6th minutes. All those in favor, please say aye.
Couldn't we amend it, though, to have those put in there? I mean, why wouldn't we? I was trying to change you that I thought Ross was going to respond before we voted.
Let me ask a question to clarify. Are you trying to get all of our comments, for instance, to the facilitator? Because that would be almost verbatim minutes. And so I think we're going to be trying to transcribe the high points and the consensus points.
Yeah, just all of our meeting minutes. If you look at the ones we approved from our last regular meeting that we approved earlier tonight, have the highlights of comments by all of us. There are all the comments that came from everybody that spoke except for commissioners. We've never done that. So wouldn't it make sense that we had those comments, I don't know, highlighted? Or I know Ross wants to say something, so let's ask Ross.
All right. Well,
it is the will of the board. Right. There was a discussion and decision to do it this way as a facilitated discussion, that we would capture the highlights. If the board directs staff to conduct or develop minutes in a normal fashion, we'll be certainly comply and do that.
That's okay.
Mr.
I just
Chair?
want to know what that issue was.
Commissioner Mitchoff.
I thought we decided that after the last meeting, by the next day, there would be sort of a summary developed of what was discussed, and that was done. Why don't we just make a note in the minutes that for commissioner comments and or other discussion items, see the summary minutes and attach them. I don't think you should be doing them twice.
Yeah, we can.
I know you can do
do
whatever.
I
guess I should be directing this to my
guys,
colleagues.
Right. You need to decide.
That if there's a summary done the next day, and that's a really quick turnaround for someone who used to have to do minutes all the time. So I appreciate Denise's work on this. If that's, I think that's enough, in my opinion.
Perfect.
And there should just be noted in the minutes that a summary was prepared, and it's attached here too. That would be my suggestion.
I'm looking at sort of nodding heads, and people seem comfortable with that, so that will be our process. I think, Denise, for the minutes, for example, from tonight's meeting and other special meetings, do what you did, but then attach the summary that we prepare as part of the minutes.
Yeah, there's a note in there, and so we attach the transcript of the whiteboards, and we will add the summary minutes as suggested by, or not the summary minutes, they were just summary notes. Right. As suggested by Supervisor Mitchoff.
Great, thank you.
We will amend the minutes for this meeting.
Did we vote? Well, did we vote on? Yeah, all right, so,
What I think I heard, if I could summarize it, was I think it was approval of minutes with
Right,
the
with
addition
the
of the
additional-
summary document, so we can amend that and bring it back at our meeting in early February.
all right, so all those in favor of these amendments recognizing the summary document will be attached, please say aye. Aye, opposed, none, unanimous. So that brings us to the first item, which is the development of the potential TEP and discussion about where we are. And I'd like to turn this part over to Ross and Bill.
Great, thank you, Chair Tatson. I'm Ross Chittenden, Chief Deputy Executive Director of the Authority, and to my left is Bill Gray of Gray, Bowen, Scott, and he and I will be walking you through the next couple of items on the agenda. This first item, item 1.1, is an informational item responding to some of the comments from our meeting on January 6th, and it's intended to be some baseline and other background information that we've been working on over the last several months from a variety of sources, and have a short presentation, if we can call that up, Denise, and I'll use that to walk through this document. For members of the public, we've, in addition to the attachments that are with the staff report, the board was provided with a number of documents as a handout on the dais. I just want to inform folks of what those documents are, and they've all been documents that have been at this board at one point or another. We have a document we commonly refer to as a what you heard document that was up on the Countywide Transportation Plan website. We have a summary of what's in the staff report as attachment B, the goals and components of the growth management program. We want to just provide you a summarized version of that for reference. We've also provided an excerpt from Contra Costa County Ordinance, specifically Section 82-1.018, which describes the process to go through changes to the urban limit line. That is a topic that may be discussed here tonight. We wanted to make sure that you all have the same set of information in front of you about that process. And then we've included two documents that were handouts at the January 6th meeting. It's the document commonly referred to as a community vision document. Joel Delvencourt walked you through a presentation of that at our last meeting, and then a letter from the East Bay Leadership Council. Kristen Connolly attended our January 6th meeting and made some comments on that document. So I'll refer to all of these as I walk through this slide deck here. Let's see. I need Gary and Randy here with some technology. I got to turn this thing on. Okay, there we go. The first one here is just wanted to show this slide again. This is attachment A in your packet, and wanted to make sure you understood a point that we were trying to make in the staff report. As we all know, what we're contemplating here as a potential new measure is to increase from 1/2 cent to 1% of a sales tax that would be in effect for Contra Costa through 2034. Period beyond that is yet to be determined. If we have a 25-year sales tax, we would extend 7 years beyond that. And we still have, over the remaining life of Measure J, approximately $1.5 billion to appropriate. And I think it's important for us, and it's important for the public to know that we have these dollars available, and we need to be mindful of the outcomes that would be achieved through the appropriation of these funds. These funds are all committed to the programs and projects that are in the Measure J expenditure plan. What I've tried to highlight is where the numbers came from. The orange circle here is about $1.35 billion that's yet to be appropriated for the programs that are outlined on this table in Measure J. And then on the project side, we have roughly $1 billion of revenue that would come in, but we've already committed most of that. Similar to what Gary talked about, we've been heavily investing in advancing the program through bonding. So the majority of those project revenues are to retire our debt service, some dollars for program management, and yet there's still about $150 million that would be available for projects in the strategic plan. Hisham's currently working with the regional transportation planning committees on updating the strategic plan, so we'll be identifying the projects that would use those funds. So before we go anywhere, it's important that we know what's before us, and from the financial side, this is what's still available out of Measure J. The other significant item we want to talk about from Measure J are some of the policies. So this is a summary of the growth management program. It's from attachment B in your packet. You're all very familiar with the goals. This slide shows the goals. This slide shows the various elements or components of the growth management program. The jurisdictions, the authority here and the jurisdictions throughout the county, we've decided that we would adhere to these growth management plan elements. We demonstrate adherence through our checklist. It has been very successful over time. No jurisdiction has decided to not comply with the growth management program. As a result, all jurisdictions have remained eligible for the return to source dollars and for the transportation for livable community dollars. So we think that it's been a tremendous success. The next several slides contain information that we've developed subsequent to the direction from the board to staff and our consultant team to start development of a transportation expenditure plan. Attachment C in your packet is the document that was approved by this board in May 2016, the principles for development of a new transportation expenditure plan. We worked on that document over 3 months from about March, April, and May, and as I mentioned, it was ultimately approved at your meeting in May. The document builds off the visions established as we were discussing developing the countywide transportation plans, and I just wanted to put up some familiar words on this slide here. So this really are things that I think are concepts that have been part of our culture since the beginning of the CCTA. Attachments D and E, as well as the What We Heard document that's in your handout, represents the input we've received from the public. We've conducted a couple of polls. We've gone through an extensive outreach program with online tools, surveys, telephone town halls that other regions think are fantastic and are going to mimic. We always want to refer back to these priorities. This particular document here summarizes a number of questions from either polls or some of the survey instruments that we use with the public to put together a framework of 6 priorities, the top 6 priorities that we've heard consistently, and it's been consistent through polls, online surveys, telephone town halls. So again, we're asking our residents to consider increasing the tax from 0.5 cent to a full penny. We need to be very mindful of their priorities. So we think it's important for staff, consultants, and all stakeholders to recognize that the voters in November would be the ones who would decide the fate of this measure. So we need to be consistent with the priorities we've heard from them. And then this slide here, it's also a handout in your packet. This identifies the topics that we put before you at our January 6th meeting. These are topics that include both items that are in Measure J that we would have to consider continuing or modifying as we move into a possible new measure, as well as several other topics that have come either from you, the Expenditure Plan Advisory Committee, or other stakeholders. So the process that we outlined on January 6th is that we would schedule these in focus sessions for each of our special meetings. This list is potentially a partial list. You may identify additional items that you want to consider. You may hear testimony from the public on additional items they might want to consider. EPAC may also identify items. So as we go through the process, we'll be checking off that we've discussed and made decisions about certain items. We'll check off that we've discussed and we need to continue certain items. We may not get through all of them, or may not get through any particular one at a meeting, and we may grow the list as we work through the process. So Ivy is here to help us keep tabs on where we are. And again, this will be information that would be in the summary that we'll produce after each meeting. So with that, and then we've highlighted the first two topics up here as potential discussion items for today's session, and we've included that in the second item with some additional background information, some options to consider, and don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but we'll be introducing those to you for discussion. So that would be the process going forward. We'll pick something off this list. Staff will bring information, background information to you, options and items to consider, and our chair will lead us through a discussion of those topics. So with that, I would like to wrap up the introductory section and turn it over to the chair.
Thank you. Let me first take public comment before we see if there's any board member comment. Is there any public comment on this item of the agenda? And if there's going to be, if you do want to comment on the next item, which is 1.2, where we're going to discuss particular elements of the growth management program, if you could please fill out a speaker slip and give it to Ms. Rosenbaum so that when we get to that item, she'll be ready. Are there any commissioner comments? Seeing none, then I'd just like to say that as you go through, Chris, Kevin.
I suppose I'm not really a commissioner, I'm ex officio, but I think on potential agenda topics, I think it would be useful to have the bus agencies present what they would do, assuming they got additional funds. I know AC Transit has gone through the process because we had to go through a process for the Measure BB, where we actually did a very detailed plan for West Contra Costa. I know that Rick has a more general plan, and that Tri-Delta has a more general plan, but I don't think it's ever been presented here. And it's gone to the EPAC, it's gone to some of the regional bodies, but I think this group should add that on their
Thank you.
agenda.
And you'll notice that Ivy has moved to a chart we call the parking lot, which is things that we will get to, but not tonight. And I think this might also fit under the expenditure plan definitions and amounts and eligibility requirements. That's, for example, is on the list that we have in front of us. Is there any other authority member or commissioner comment? All right. So what I take then from this lack of discussion is that we are still in support of attachment C. And I think that then becomes, which embodied the vision and goals and principles we have, and that should be our common framework for discussing the expenditure plan and the growth management program. So I think we should all keep that in mind as we continue on to item 1.2. And what I'd like to do at the beginning of this is to make a proposal for how we handle this item so we can get as far as possible this evening. And that is that we're going to ask Ross and Bill to present the report that's going to outline the scope of what's in the growth management plan today, some of the alternatives that have been proposed to us. And they're also going to make suggestions based on the conversations they've had as to where there might be common or essentially acceptable ground, recognizing that they speak neither for the authority at this point nor for all of the interest groups with whom they've met. We will then take what I'd like to limit to be questions from members of the authority to clarify what you hear from staff. And then with that background, we're going to ask for public comment. When that is over, we will bring it back to the authority. And what I'd like to do is, or suggest, is that we go through the points of the growth management program, which are outlined on the charts on pages 1.2-8 and 1.2-9, and discuss each of those in turn and try to see if we can provide some direction to our staff and consultants. At the end of that, we will try to summarize the authority's position, assuming there is a single position, or there may also be additional questions that come out that we're not prepared to answer this evening. And then the staff and consultants will continue to meet with the interest groups and draft modifications to the growth management program as a result of that. And I've already been asked by one member, how long are we going to go tonight? And the goal is to finish by 9. However, if we've done all that and we're quick, then perhaps we will dip our toes into some of the topics on page 1.2-10, perhaps beginning with a focus on return to source. Now, you will notice we do not have a moderator this evening. Therefore, the responsibility to keeping us on track and keeping the public on track falls to me, but it also falls on all of us. Please be kind. I'll need the help. So I may ask speakers, both from the public and authority members, to focus their comments if they seem to be drifting off course. As I pointed out, we have a parking lot, so we can capture your thought, and we'll remember to come back to those items either at this meeting or later. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Ross and Bill again.
I think Bill's going to introduce the topic after the outline that the chair made. That we'll tag team it through question and answer.
Thank you. And, kind of restate, I'm going to try to go through at least all of the topics on here at a high level so we can have an informed public so they know what we're going to be talking about and kind of the direction that I think staff is going, and then we're going to engage the board in a more detailed discussion. Our hope for tonight is we're calling a robust discussion on growth management. Your current growth management plan, as you have it, adopted it in both Measure C and refined a bit in J, and we've been working it now really for almost 28 years, I think, by my count. So it's a plan that's been in place. Contra Costa is still somewhat unique in the state, where we started back in 1988 with a combination of growth management and transportation, and we've been trying to deal with those. So my discussion tonight is really going to focus on that and related issues, and it's going to spring off of the discussion you had or the presentation you heard last meeting from Joel Davenport and representing a coalition of environmental and business, or not business, but environmental and other groups, labor included. And what it may be a little bit confusing, because I'm going to follow the order in your packet tonight, which is really modeled after the existing growth management program. Because as your staff and consultant team start to look at all of these different proposals, we want to plug them into what you already have. So we're not talking about so the order may be different from what the community division was presented last week, but the sum of it, all of those topics can be discussed. So as I get into this now, the first element on that chart, and this is the chart on page 8, 1.2-8, your current growth management program requires a growth management element. And as the TEP is developed and approved with Measure J, included a transportation for livable communities program that focused on funding for projects that support and encourage walkable communities. One of the proposals you heard last week from the community vision document was incentives to encourage infill development and reward jurisdictions that provide affordable housing in their communities. In our opinion, the existing TLC program, which is consistent with the goals of the growth management plan, which include housing and infill, would be a logical way to address this proposal or suggestion. So in other words, not set up a new program for infill, but rather augment the current TLC program. And so we're considering including in a draft TEP, as we're putting together the pieces here, an augmentation of the current TLC program, which would maybe provide more funds for the existing program and might provide some enhanced guidelines or new incentives to improve the program. We're kind of labeling it a TLC plus, maybe a little bit, kind of a refinement of that. One option being considered might include housing needs and or production in the criteria that you use to evaluate and allocate funds. While we understand that maintaining regional equity is an important part of this, the fact of the matter is that some agencies may find it difficult to achieve some of these goals if we change it. And in that regard, the equity issue, we feel we can provide guidelines that provide a sub-regional equity, so that each part of the county, in effect, can deal with these issues on their own. So it won't be weighted one part of the county or the other, but rather each very successful sub-regional committee would, in effect, deal with that issue as you go forward. It's a concept right now. There's not a specific proposal. So that, on growth management, that's probably the biggest suggestion. Now, we also have, in the proposal that came forth last week, there's some mixed up different things. One of them was, for example, an ag protection ordinance. The presentation that we heard before had a proposal that all jurisdictions with ag lands within their planning areas would be adopting an ag protection ordinance. Our initial reaction to the proposal would be to suggest that the issue be integrated into any proposals to modify the urban limit line. And for example, we would maybe suggest revisions to the findings, not the 30-acre issue, but the findings that would suggest that if a proposed amendment to the urban limit line would encompass impact ag lands, then that agency would be required to address the impacts of those ag lands through additional findings, conditions of approval, and or mitigation. So that's the thought process that we have. There was a whole list of suggested additional policies and standards, such as hillside development ordinance, ridgeline ordinances, et cetera. These policies, they called them transformative policies, suggest that this is the community vision. When I refer back, that's what I'm referring to. The way to deal with this might be to add some or all of these issues to your checklist, your GMP checklist. And at this point, we don't have any specific recommendations. We think a lot of the existing jurisdictions already have a lot of these, and over the next few weeks, we're going to be kind of polling that. We would recommend, to the degree that you all agree, and you already have a lot of these policies in place, that we consider adding that to the checklist. And if for no other reason, it would be to disclose whether you have them or not, as opposed to your list now is a compliance checklist. There might be appropriate in terms of disclosure simply to acknowledge if you have some of these other policies in place. Again, at this point, I'm not suggesting a requirement, but more of a disclosure of the fact that they're there and they exist. The next item down your list, now I'm back to the second item, adopt a development mitigation program. That's a core part of the original Measure C in 1988.
If I could just,
Sure.
maybe if you could, would it help if we put page 2-8 up on the screen?
If we can, yeah. Good idea. Yeah. We could do them one by one. That's up to them. Okay. On the development mitigation program, that's a core element, as I mentioned, with the original Measure C, it was reaffirmed, if you will, with Measure J. One of the, over the years, the various regions of the county have basically approached this requirement in different ways, and the question that we'd like to encourage you to talk about tonight is, should we be looking at an enhancement to that program, some changes to that program? It's really more of a question, and we're interested in input. The next one on that list, on your list in your growth management program, is address housing options. And this is a big area of concern, if you will, or questions through the community vision document. Among other things, they proposed a requirement suggested a requirement that all jurisdictions hold an annual public informational hearing on the housing element, your APR, Housing Element Progress Report. We've been advised that this is already a requirement of the California Department of Housing and Community Development, so we're working to confirm that this is the case. And again, this may be one thing you just disclose on your checklist, that you had the hearing on some date certain. The idea here is just make it kind of a public disclosure, if you will, of how well your community is doing in terms of that. So it seems like it's not an inappropriate request, particularly if you're already doing it. one of the other elements that fits under the housing options is an incentive for building competitive transportation fund. The suggestion was is that a pot of money, if you will, as an incentive for local agencies to deal with infill housing and incentivize that. And again, I mentioned previously already the idea of augmenting the TLC program, your current TLC program, and then maybe using some of the enhanced or modified requirements or principles as further the incentives. And I would, as a comment, although this was a big part of the presentation of the environmental community and that coalition, it's also something that the business community and the building community are very interested as well. In other words, how we incentivize and make development within, as Ross pointed out last month or last week, 2 weeks ago, was development within the urban limit lines is good. Development within the core areas or PDAs is even better. And it helps us in transportation, it helps us with transit, it helps in a variety of ways. So to the degree that we can augment that or encourage that through this process is a win-win for everybody. Complete streets policy, just very quickly, we've gotten proposals for basically a standalone category for complete streets, some funds to do that. Complete streets are already a requirement for all of you that receive state or federal funds. It's just a part of the process. We're still kind of pondering some different ideas at the staff consultant team level. Maybe just augmenting all of the various programs to in effect support or encourage a proactive complete streets program, because it's a legitimate and real issue. I mean, to the degree that we can get better access into the transit stations and into our downtown areas and avoid having to use single occupant vehicles. So it's a good idea, and whether it's practical is a different question. The whole issue of anti-displacement was a suggestion, is that we provide some language that in the community vision proposal, they were actually suggesting funding be included to deal with the displacement issue. It's a challenging issue because it's an issue being dealt at the regional level right now. And at a minimum, we're considering language that would suggest or require compliance with any agreed to regional requirements as a part of your plan. But we don't necessarily think it's appropriate to allocate a specific amount of funds to a program like that, at least at this juncture. At this point, because it fits right in here, is that with Measure J, if you recall, we had effectively a regional choice pot of money where everybody was able, the West County, East County, the various regional committees were able to, in effect, prioritize what was important to them. We're thinking of the same thing, and it's very likely in the next few weeks, I think, that as the staff and consultant team would be, in effect, suggesting that we prioritize some of these local needs. It's basically an augmentation of what we'd already heard from the regional committees, but in effect putting it in a priority order. And then this would allow areas of the county, if they wanted to prioritize school bus transit or student bus passes, or even the anti-displacement program. So the flexibility that was an inherent part of last two measures you did, we want to continue that. There was another suggestion that you modify your formula for return to source funds to include housing production and other related factors. At this point, the staff consultant team would not be recommending any change to your long-standing formula to allocate return to source funds back to your communities. It's a 50% road population, 50% road miles. It's an issue that, let's see my notes here. We think this issue of housing is best dealt with through an augmented TLC program. So as I've talked about that twice already, I won't repeat that, and we're interested in your reaction to that in further discussion. The next item on your list, it's the next page actually on your chart here, is participate in ongoing cooperative multi-jurisdictional planning process. That's one element of our Measure C that continued in J, and has been very successful. Lots of good dialogue about different projects. The issue that was raised by the Community Vision Group was using, where am I here? Instead of VMT, or using changing the, hang on a second, getting ahead of myself a second. You know, you currently, the bottom line in here is the modeling requirements. And right now, the requirements for modeling that you do on new development, and it's VMT versus trip generation, typical trip generation rates. That's a process that your staff is already working on, and it's a policy of your board rather than embedded in the TEP, the draft TEP or your ordinances. So, you know, there's really no change that we would be suggesting to your TEP as a result of that kind of a recommendation. So we think that's best handled that way. And Ross can talk about a little bit later about what specifically you're doing. One of the significant, the next item on your list, growth management list, and I promise I'm getting close to the end, is adopt an urban limit line. And one of the proposals that was suggested 2 weeks ago was elimination or modifying the provision of the county's ULL that allows a 30-acre adjustment without voter approval. And at this point, our team, our staff and consultant team, isn't prepared to recommend any changes to that provision. But we do think additional findings and/or process requirements related to changes might be a topic for consideration. And in effect, in my words, but is in effect more sunshine on proposals like that. And for example, I mentioned already the ag issue. If you have a proposal that's going to impact ag land, it's not an unfair request to show how you're going to mitigate that impact. One of the other suggestions of the community vision was the allocation of services by special districts outside of the urban limit line. And you know, the bottom line here is that since your authority doesn't allocate any money to special districts, you really have no leverage, even if you wanted to induce them or motivate them to not provide services out there, right? That's one very unique element of Contra Costa's measure in your return to source. It affects all your jurisdictions, all the cities, but you can't impact others. So as a result, we're not going to have any recommendations related to that. I think, that's all on the first 2 pages in here. I don't want to go any further than that, and I put out a lot of information, and I think, I hope that was relatively clear, and we're prepared to kind of review each one of these on a one-by-one basis as we get into the more
Great. Well,
detailed
thank you.
discussion.
And for those of you who are sort of looking around, what Bill did was he did go through the 7 points on pages 8 and 9. In some cases, he added a few items from page 10. Speaker's prerogative, I guess. But as we go through and discuss it, maybe what we should first do is discuss what's on pages 8 and 9 first, and if there's time, we can get into the page 10 items. And now, at this point, are there questions of clarification of staff before we move to public comment? Commissioner Mitchoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, thank you. On 1.2-8, I thank you for doing this. Very, very, very helpful. Excuse me. Under 3, addressing housing options, I get the what's in Measure J. I get option 2 because there's a recommendation to split those. But option 3, am I missing something, or is the only difference the adding of the word monitor? Because number 2 in option 2, number 1 in option 2 says blah, 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 and demonstrate progress in providing housing for all income groups. And in option 3, demonstrate and monitor progress in providing. Are we just trying to be clearer, or is that the only difference, or what are we going for?
To be real honest, I was following the topic level lines on this. The two options were prepared by your staff, and I don't think Ross or I are really prepared to go into a lot of details.
Well, I can on a lot of them. And that particular one, I can say it came out of BIA, and I can't answer your specific question because when I read it here, it's very...
Right, exactly. Option 2 and option 3 depend on who the author was.
Yeah.
So option 2 is the community vision. Option 3 is what we heard from Kristen Conley at the last meeting.
I just, thank you. I'm sorry if I missed that clarification earlier. I see that the community vision document, but additional. So thank you so much.
Commissioner Button and Commissioner Arnold.
I'm confused when you were talking about having a checklist versus disclosure. I don't understand.
Well, my understanding in general is that your checklist now is a compliance checklist, and what I'm suggesting you might want to do is, in effect, in addition to the specific requirements, that you comply with these 8 provisions or 7 provisions. You go further, and then issues like when you had a hearing on your housing element or a performance element or other, if you have other significant land use ordinances that fit some of the criteria that was in here, if you have them, just disclose the fact. No requirement that you have it, at least the way we're thinking about it now.
Well, and maybe I can add a little bit more in context to
Wait,
that.
let me, so there would still be compliance requirements, but the disclosure would be like icing on the cake, like, yeah, we're in compliance, but by the way, we're also doing A, B, and C.
Right, or the other could be you're not, and that way it's for folks, some folks would like us to be the police of everything, which ultimately, if we go too far, it takes away local control. Flip side of that is through this process, you say what you're doing, and if folks want to come talk to your city council for something you're not doing or not doing, they just have that information. So it's trying to split the baby a little bit here of not, trying to police local control. But Bill uses the word sunshine a lot. Just put some additional sunshine.
Well, I'm still confused. So there would be maybe some cities that, aren't doing half of these things, but if they disclose it, it's okay. They don't have to do them.
Well, that's one of the issues we want to talk about later with your board. There's 8 or 9 suggestions for additional policies and standards that the community vision document suggested that you add as compliance requirements. And we're coming short of that, at least now. Our thought is, before hearing from your board, is that disclosure is an appropriate change. Requiring everybody to have all of these ordinances might be a cumbersome requirement. We think it would be a cumbersome requirement.
So what's the downside of somebody not having any of the additional policy options? There's no downside to it, and there's no reward for doing it.
Well, I think the first question is, do you agree that any or all of these should be included in your compliance checklist? That's the question that we'd like to explore with you tonight. And if you, for example, give us direction that having a policies or standards to streamline policy review for infill development or PDAs is a good idea, then we would incorporate that thought in a plan. If you don't,
for the record, most of them sound pretty good to me.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's what we want to hear from the board as a whole.
All right, that's fine. Commissioner Arnold.
Thank you. Just a quick question, staff, and I was trying to look it up and I can't find it. How many cities of our 19 have their own ULL as opposed to the county? Is it 3? I know it's San Ramon.
3. It's San Ramon, Pittsburgh, and Antioch.
Okay, those 3. All right, thanks. I think it's important we kind of remember because a lot of those rules, it really is all up to the county, or it's up to 3 cities. So we need to keep perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Abelson?
Yes, you were talking about connecting housing to the TLC program.
As an option, yes.
Okay, I don't actually see words that say that, but that's okay. The thing I was wondering about is what I remember about the TLC program. It was about, especially as originally developed at MTC, it was originally developed to connect people and enable them to get from a place into the transit center. So if you then take that to this topic of housing, just saying housing doesn't necessarily do it. An example that I would give of that is if you built a housing development on one side of a freeway and on the other side of the freeway without a road, there were a BART station. Well, those people have no access at all to BART, even though they're nearby. So what you actually have to have, in addition to having that housing, which sounds like an interesting idea to me, is the connection. So that would need to be included, I would think,
So can I
in that. Uh-huh.
This is a good parking lot topic because it's moved a little bit beyond the question into an opinion about that, which is fine. Just hold off if you would, please. Let's try and take questions now.
So we're going to have an opportunity later to say what we think.
Oh, yes, exactly.
One topic at a time.
One topic at a time so we can be focused. All right, are there other questions? All right, with that then, let's move on to public comment. At this point, I only have 2 speaker slips. And again, I would ask you to focus your comments on the items that have been presented this evening, as opposed to all the other parts of the program that we may ultimately adopt. So our first speaker is Kenji Yamada, to be followed by Joel DeValcourt. And again, we ask each speaker to limit his or her comments to 3 minutes.
Thank you.
You just put it on your computer. I'll do it.
There you go. Go for it. Great. Sounds good to me. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Authority Board, members of staff. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'd like to comment on the Complete Streets recommendation from the Environmental Coalition's Community Vision document. The point of view was expressed a while ago that complete streets requirements are nice, a good thing, but perhaps not feasible in some cases. Feasible in the context of complete streets is usually another way of saying possible without risking any significant delay to motor traffic. Complete streets improvements are generally least feasible in this sense where they are most needed for safety, that is on high traffic streets such as Street Boulevard, which we have just a short distance from this room. I'd like to advance to you the point that if we wait for opportunities to make these improvements at times and in places where motor traffic is not going to be impacted, we will fail to put them in where they are most needed. I understand the point that the Authority Board is reluctant to put strictures on local jurisdictions that would limit their flexibility for particular circumstances. But I can tell you from experience that at the local level, it really helps to have some standards coming with the money that funds these projects. And the money does, of course, generally come from the county or the state and not from local sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the speaker? Mr. DeValcourt? And then to be followed by Amy Ma. And that's Ms. Ma is the last speaker slip I have, so welcome.
Hi, everybody. Good to be back. Thank you to the new chair, Don Tatson, and thank you to all. I wasn't really prepared to give remarks tonight, and just want to, I guess, keep an open flow of information. I'm here to answer questions about the presentation that I made at your previous special session, and just to say that some of the suggestions in the consultant's report are not quite accurate to where we feel the conversation needs to go. And that being said, I really appreciate the back and forth that we've had, but want to make it really clear that we are still open to a frank conversation about some of these issues, and we believe they're not quite resolved. So that being said, happy to answer any questions or be of any value this evening in your conversation.
Are there any questions? Okay, Commissioner
I
Mitchell.
still have my question from last time of, I know what the group wants, but at some point, are we going to get the response to why there's been a problem, like on the urban limit line and the 30-acre issue? That was a specific question I had.
I'd be happy to provide that information. I haven't been invited to respond to those questions.
Well, no, you were invited last time.
That's a question, so you can respond.
Well, yeah, if you can keep it under 3 minutes, which
Right.
I don't think. I thought we were going to get some sort of response back in writing as to where you saw the problems exist unless we do these things.
Okay, yeah, that was not communicated to me in
Okay.
that particular way, but I appreciate the question. Should I respond to that
If
right
you can
now?
do it quickly,
Off
yes.
cuff. One of the things that we did not provide was some visual information in our presentation at the request of several members, the consultant team as well as staff, because we didn't want to cross any lines and point fingers at issues in the county that have been longstanding for several decades. and I want to respect that this evening as well. There are particular threats that have come through both the 30-acre exception rule as well as challenges to the urban limit line, the county's urban limit line, also some of the unique jurisdictions that have adopted their own. There are several fundamental issues, many of them related to the speculation of land at the urban edge and what that does to the value, particularly of agricultural land. So when there are multiple proposals to annex agricultural land, many of those property owners will continue to leave their land fallow, will go out of production, and then ultimately much of that land becomes increased in value, and they're no longer able to lease for agricultural productive purposes. So that's one issue is literally the land use itself begins to flip before land's annexed.
Has there been a problem then? I get what you're talking about,
Right.
that it increases the value of the land if they left it fallow, but has it then turned into the issue where they have applied to exceed the urban limit line?
Well, one of the things that we've analyzed is the amount of times that the urban limit line has been challenged over the last 10 years and what that's resulted in.
That's what I would like to see. I
Right.
would like a written document of where the challenges have been and what the resolution was.
I actually have that
That's
visual
fine.
aid literally on a thumb drive in my bag right now, and I can
Well,
actually
no,
provide that
just
to the
get it to
commission.
staff and it can be part of our,
Fair
because
enough.
I have a hard time visualizing where there's been exceedance of the urban limit line.
Okay, great.
I think it's held pretty strong.
I have a related follow-on question. Mr. Gray suggested that perhaps one approach to this topic is to modify the process through which 30-acre or less amendments are considered. Recognizing we haven't exactly proposed what those are, is that something that's worthy of further discussion?
This is kind of what I'm talking. This is the reason why I came to the public comments tonight. I was not prepared to make compromises in public comment period tonight about this, and I think it would have been nice to have been put in the position to have known that. I didn't let my coalition members know that, and so it's a little bit of a dance that I have to play here because I want to recognize that good work has been done by the staff and consultant team, and I also want to recognize that I have not been given the time or opportunity to work with my coalition partners on really any of the proposals that actually aren't even in the staff report.
Okay. All right, understand. Thank you.
Todd.
Commissioner Pierce?
Yeah, let me just suggest for Joel's comfort, I don't think anybody expected you to answer things on the spur of the moment, and some of those discussion items will certainly go back to the EPAC at the end of this month for discussion. You will likely have a similar discussion there to what we're having here. I think what the consultants have tried to do is give us some suggestions of a middle ground between where we are now and what the community vision document asked for, to try and help us draw a compromise and see how close we might be. It may be that as we discuss, we find we're closer to the community vision than the consultants thought, or that we're further away from it. And that's the purpose of going through these one at a time now. And so, but yes, Joel, we would still love to see that information when you can get it to staff and they can disseminate it. That would be great, but we're not putting you on the spot. We know you've got to talk to your people.
I'm sorry. I'm happy to be put on the spot to answer questions. I think really what I'm talking about is whether or not we're having substantive conversation about policies this evening. I'd rather answer questions first than be asked to make compromises. And I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Right. Commissioner Hudson?
Yeah, Joel, you mentioned county and municipal urban limit line. And maybe I'm missing it, but I thought what Supervisor Mitchoff was asking for was examples. She asked for it in writing, not just policies or, I'm sure, I can't remember exactly what the word you used. I mean, do you have an example that you want to give, or do you want to wait and get an example of, let me just focus on the municipal, because that's what mine is, of someone, and according to your option 2, that wants to eliminate or reduce the 30-acre exemption. You do? I mean, one that you could give us, one example?
Oh, yeah, well, there's currently a 30-acre exception process that is under well, actually, I'm not entirely sure what the stage of the process is, but it's been proposed. It's the Tazahara Parks area right outside of Danville and San Ramon. It's outside the urban limit line, and there is currently a proposal moving forward, and I'm not really, I guess, a state to say where it's at right now at this moment, but it would be the first time it was used for a housing development outside the urban limit line, and it is being...
Okay, this is just to help to clarify.
Right.
Then what you're talking about is, we're back up to this option 2, that for you there are examples of potential outside the existing urban limit line, and you don't care whether it's 30 acres or 3 acres, it's something outside the urban limit line. Anything outside the existing urban limit line
should be required by a vote of the people. That's the 30-acre exception was an element of essentially the compromise of 2004, and we understand that that's currently the lay of the land, and that is why the process is moving forward. And we, as well as our environmental allies, Greenbelt Alliance, I can speak for, believe that as we move forward, it's better to remove the kind of speculative impacts of a 30-acre exception, especially in hotly contested land use battles over 20 to 30 years. Those should be solved by a vote of the people. It's not to undermine the power, let's say, of the Board of Supervisors. It's just to lay some really, really clear guidelines for the existing urban limit line, which we believe should be in the hands of the people.
And last part to that, and you don't think that eliminating the 30 acres should go to a vote either? Just it should be eliminated?
Well, it would be a vote of the people as part of a sales tax measure.
But you want everybody in the county to vote, or just in that jurisdiction?
Oh,
Given the Tassajara example, which is in one end of the county,
right.
You would want everyone in the county to vote on that one area.
Well, no, so San Ramon has their own urban growth boundary, so it's...
This is not in San Ramon.
No, this is county.
This has nothing to do with San Ramon.
And I know we're getting into details here, but that's the issue. And in 12 years, if one project has come forward, which is, granted has still not even been decided, it's in abeyance, so to speak, I think the current urban limit line has worked very, very well.
And we wouldn't doubt that there have been no successful challenges to it. The point that we're making is that with, I think it's even been the words have been used in this room, which is it's easier to propose in some communities to go outside of the urban limit line than it is to do infill within our communities. And that's really some of the conundrum that we're working with, which is the basis for our presentation last week.
Thank you. I think we've gotten a sense. You're going to provide us with additional information. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
And it'll be discussed at EPAC and probably come back and be discussed here. Commissioner Arneridge.
Joel, I appreciate, I was going to go back. At last meeting, I actually had asked, and I guess I wasn't clear. It was exactly what she was, you had come up with a list, and I thought, like I said, I liked most of the ideas. But the ask was to come back with not what really has been done and why you have the concern. Because we know most of them never happened, right? There's pros. And also be a little careful, 2 of your partners on that exception you're talking about are supporting it.
They're actually working within the confines of law, and to say that they're supporting it is very premature.
Well, I'm just going to say, just please be careful and let's be transparent. So put it on there, and
put what on there?
Put on your list. It's like doing a chart like this. You've come up with these reasons. Put your reasoning behind it, because you didn't present that, and I think it would help with specific.
We were under suggestion to not attempt to create lines in the state. So this already is not really going well tonight.
Right. So
let me finish. Joel, you're arguing, and all I'm asking you to do is not now. It wasn't what you did. I thought what you did was a wonderful job. What we're asking you to do is bring back some additional information in writing that would help us. That's all. And I just want to corroborate that. I asked for it last time. It's not new. And aside from what staff is doing, I'd take the chart of all the things that you've done. Put down there the examples of why you're concerned about that. It will help all of us. It'll help people sitting in the audience.
I could literally pull up the map, and we could take the time 10 minutes right now.
Let's not, because I think people are asking for additional things. So submit it to us, and let's put this on the parking lot as the 30-acre exemption.
Right. So we can think about it. I don't want to respond.
Right. So, okay. Thank you. Our next speaker is Amy Ma. Welcome.
So, thanks. I also wasn't prepared for a question until the speaker had mentioned something to me. Or mentioned something to everybody. He mentioned about complete streets and feasibility. Complete streets may not get specific funding. Complete streets are so important as our community grows. We have large developments, for instance, coming into my community, which is Concord, massive developments. And if we wait to put that infrastructure in, we're never going to put it in. We need to put it in before the developments get there so that we can decrease emissions, so that we can encourage biking throughout our city, and so that we can, and this isn't just our city, this is throughout. This should be like a predominant feature for funding in every single city where there's development occurring. I grew up in Seattle, and they had none. It's the worst transit place ever. I understand that feasibility also could be where cars can have precedence. No, cars already have precedence. We have 6, 7, 8-lane streets in some places. We can't give them any more precedence. We really need to start thinking about alternative forms of transportation as a priority. And I'm not saying that you're not. I'm just saying from a community aspect, coming from this, my first time in a meeting like this and first time speaking in front of people and learning about this, it is something that my neighbors, I've spoken with many neighbors, we want to ride our bikes to the grocery stores, not for leisure, for functionality. Give us the infrastructure and we will do it. That's what I'm saying, is that make it a feasible, make it so that priority happens for something that we can all work together on, which is biking and walking and decreasing the potential for future congestion by allowing for complete streets and finding a way to guide our city politicians or government to distribute the money appropriately, because we need effective, efficient, and safe. If it's not efficient, it's not going to get used. It will not be effective, and if it's not safe, it's not going to get used. Thank you.
Are there questions of the speaker? All right, is there any other public comment? All right, then seeing none, we'll bring it back to the authority. And what we said we do, if you turn back to page 1.2-8, you will see if we go back to the first page of the chart, Ross. Right. So this is the adopt the growth management element, and the every jurisdiction has to have a growth management element, and really the questions that are in front of us are, will we require jurisdictions to have the set of ordinances, for example, that have been proposed on page 1.6, which would include a hillside development ordinance, a ridgeline protection ordinance, an open space system, et cetera. And then also, do we require some sort of program for
1.2-6.
right, ag protection?
Mr. Chair, I'm confused. Of the chart that's been prepared on 1.2.8, the first thing is adopt a growth management element. What's in Measure J is stated, but nobody's asking for anything different.
Well, I think, again, this is where Bill went a little bit off the reservation in the sense that he brought up some things that they have proposed, which are listed in page 1.2-6, which include things like the hillside development ordinance.
Well, that goes back to my earlier question, I think Newell too. We were talking about urban limit line, but I'd like to have some examples of where current hillside ordinances haven't worked, because we heard both sides. So I'm not prepared to commit on a hillside ordinance issue.
Okay. And many jurisdictions have hillside ordinances.
Right.
They have these kinds of ordinances. They're not necessarily the same. And this is where I think Bill's recommendation was that rather than requiring them for all jurisdictions, because I'm not clear what Brentwood would do with a hillside ordinance, all. Okay, well, I'm not sure what Oakley would do with the hillside ordinance, right? It may be something that the authority wants to know whether you have one. And so it's informational only. That's essentially what was suggested by our staff.
And I appreciate that. I guess we have a lot of work to do, and to me, the current growth management element seems to already take all of that into account. That would be my position. But I'm open to hearing what other people have to say, because again, I'm not seeing where it hasn't worked.
Other comments? Commissioner Pierce.
Yeah, I think my comment would be to agree with the staff that many of the things in our current growth management element are working extremely well. And we're working hard to fulfill them. Many of us also have gone way beyond what's currently required in our growth management program. We've adopted, if applicable, things like wildlife corridors and creekside setbacks and protections, and we've put in hillside development ordinances as slope protection ordinances and open space areas. We've defined where those are going to be. We've put them into preservation agreements, things like that. But that may not apply to everybody. It may not be appropriate for everybody. So I think the suggestion of having this as a box, have you considered, have you done? Yes, you have. No, you haven't. Just like, how did you spend your transportation dollars? So many cubic feet of asphalt, we paved this many streets, it cost X. How are we using the dollars? How are we planning for the future? What is right? It would be just a way of helping everyone to know what's out there. And for those who have gone beyond and done some of these extra things, like some of the things that Tom has done in their community, it would be a resource so that if someone wants an example, they can know who to talk to for an example of how they want to do it. I mean, if somebody's got a hillside ordinance and somebody else wants to know how, now they can check and they can
but
see.
they don't have to go to this document, because my concern is if you say hillside, have you considered or do you have a hillside development ordinance? What about a city who checks the box no, and then they get challenged because you should have one?
But it wouldn't be a compliance issue.
But
It
then
would just
why
be in there
put
for
it in there?
information.
Well,
Just
for
an
information, they can go and ask, you can call a city, do you have a hillside ordinance? I don't think it should be in our growth management element.
Thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Hudson.
Yeah, my first thought was I agree with Karen, but I look at this again and I go, this is probably one of their ideas that's a good idea for that very reason without restating it. That, who knows? I mean, 5 years from now, we may be doing the review that we do every 5 years and decide that this needs a little bit more weight. If nothing else, it may end up on a cost-benefit analysis or a cost-effective analysis, and people should be informed of this. Cities need to know what the pluses and the minuses are. In fact, I don't mind the option 3s also, as far as being on the checklist. But if you put no, and the thought that you're not going to get any money because of that, no, I'm off on that. But growth management elements do that. I have a hard time convincing. I go back to the old growth management where we were looking at standards, 1 policeman per 1,000 people. And my goodness, I don't know if anybody was making that except for a few of us. So, but it is a good disclosure. And I would concur that this is probably something that can go on the group, but not as a must adopt, as a check the box. And in 5 years from now, you may find out that every single city and the county has every one of these, and either that's meaningless or a good thing, but we'll find out.
So can I ask so could I, hang on. Could I ask the authority members whether there's anyone who believes that the ordinances that have been listed should be required? I don't see anybody saying yes. Okay, so now.
I have a comment.
Okay.
Despite what I said earlier, I mean, some of these things I really like prohibitions on culverting blue line creeks, but I guess maybe one way of trying to sift through these would be to evaluate whether they have any impact on transportation, whether they have any impact on greenhouse gas reduction, maybe some other criteria. So, some of these might, like the last one, G, kind of deals, we're sort of dealing with sprawl, that's kind of a sprawl-related thing. So you could find that nexus. And on the other hand, a hillside development ordinance, there are communities in the county that don't even have hillsides or ridges. So why would you ding somebody for not, why would you ding somebody for not having a hillside ordinance when they don't have any hillsides? So I'm thinking maybe taking these and running them through that test to see if they have a nexus to the kinds of things we're really interested in here. This group is not about design review and things like, we're not about that, but we are about a lot of things, and if there's a nexus, then I think they belong in here.
So, other comments about Commissioner Leone?
Yeah, I would suggest that we be very cautious of putting things in a document that we're saying it doesn't matter, because there's an old saying about keeping it simple. And when you start putting things in there and it becomes more convoluted, there's going to be people that will start questioning, well, why is it in there? There's a reason why they're doing that. So I'm just saying that we just need to be very careful about this, because people will read into things.
Okay. So to the question of was Commissioner Butt's comments accepted, and I think your comments might refer to the plan to conserve buffers around open space and agricultural and no development of major subdivisions, et cetera, in non-urban priority conservation areas. Probably it's the two.
Well, I think that would pass the test, because that's essentially an anti-sprawl policy.
So those would fit within your.
Yeah, I would. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But if you take the others, if I can try and get a sense of, is there a preference to not require any notification of what the jurisdictions do, or to have the jurisdictions indicate which of these other ones they have, but it wouldn't count towards your compliance?
I'm hearing a request to keep them off the checklist altogether.
Well, and one of the where I'm going with some of this too is, remember, this has to go to each city for approval, and they're going to have this debate there too. And the more that we put in there, that then, as Ron says, the yes, no, not applicable. And I would argue, if the PCA is within the urban limit line, that's where ABAG comes in, and you're trying to get money. I don't know of any PCAs that are inside our urban limit line. So if they're outside, they're not going to get developed. So there's so much in here, and they're good planning concepts. But I agree with Tom. They're not, the nexus to me is not really there with transportation. And I'm looking at it from a policy perspective, but I'm also looking at it from all of the 19 cities in our county have to approve this. And that's a high lift.
Mr. Chair?
So, Bill.
This is exactly the kind of conversation we need, but I think we've got all the input we need on this issue. We've heard you're not really inclined to do anything with these lists, but now in the context of working with the various stakeholder groups, my feedback to them is, absent some findings and some reasons why, specific reasons, you're not inclined to make a change. We had suggested a compromise, which is a disclosure, but I'm not hearing a lot of excitement about that. That's the kind of input that we need as your staff and consultant team. And I think overarching, and I just say it as a matter of principle, I'm hearing you want justification for any specific proposal that we, as your consultant or staff and or an advocacy group, might propose. And that's clear. That's the kind of input we need. I was trying to reach a middle ground, because we've got a lot of stuff to do and we don't have a lot of time. So that kind of direction is fine, and we can feed it back to the group.
And the only thing I would say, it looks like you may want to go back and consider E and G somewhat differently. E may relate to an agricultural policy. I'm not sure G is possible. Why would you have a priority conservation development with a major subdivision in it? So, okay. Could we move on, or does anybody else want to talk about?
Quick suggestion, if I can. I mean, this is the first test that we put out there for one of the suggestions, page 10. If you got a moment, email out to the cities and ask the cities if any of them have passed these ordinances they're talking about. We may find out that 16 cities have these things already, and we're wasting our time.
I like Bill's suggestion. That, at least that's my concept, is anytime there's a proposal to change it, doesn't mean it's good or bad. I would just like to see justification, and I think that'll streamline our conversations in the future.
Okay, Commissioner Cruz, I'm trying to move to item 2.
I know you're trying to move to item 2, but.
I think Commissioner Arnold.
Keep re-talking.
No, but this goes to things that are not in that A through G. There are several other bullets on that same page that were suggested for things that should be in the growth management plan, such as a listing, and the suggestion by staff is, contrary to the requirement to do an annual meeting, it might be, since we are state required to do an annual review and submit to HCD an annual progress report, just to list the date that we held the public hearing at our meeting.
Moving ahead to about item 4.
I thought this was all being asked to be on the growth management plan.
Well, but it also shows up specifically in the housing element as where Bill addressed it.
Oh, well, that was one example. There are other examples here on this page, though. So I don't know. If you want to break them up, then that's fine. That's just confusing, because if we're talking growth management plan, we're talking about growth management plan and the checklist. So, okay, go ahead.
Okay.
You're running the meeting.
All right, Commissioner Arnold.
I don't want to shortchange this item, because morally, we should all be doing this, right? I mean, we all should have hillside roads. I mean, this is good, smart planning. And I know we're saying there isn't the nexus for it. Some of us have all of these already, so it's not even an issue. Others don't. Others are doing things in those areas that they probably shouldn't, but that's who we are. But I personally believe these are the right things to do. I don't think that should be our conversation, because we'll be here forever if we're going to say these are morally and ethically the right things we ought to be doing in all of our communities. This is why we all live on this planet, right? But do these, I agree with what everybody's saying, that I can't see us trying to rewrite everybody's general plan through this type of measure. We have honored growth management by being the first agency, as we said last time, to come up with a growth management element, and a big deal, a ULL. But I hope that we walk away knowing that these are not just things we're flipping off saying, well, we're not going to include them. These are really the right things to do. But I agree, putting them in a checklist serves no purpose, because then I don't want to mislead our public thinking that, oh, we're really doing this. Either we are or we aren't, and be honest and be transparent. So putting on a checklist looks as though, oh, we have that in there. We really don't. Some cities do, and I don't think it's going to serve a purpose.
Okay. Commissioner Romick?
A little clarification. So the bullet points that precede the ABC, we're going to address at some other issue at some other time.
Yes.
It concerns
Yeah.
me.
We'll get to all of those.
Okay, I just
Like address housing options, we'll discuss the
well, this has
report
to
on the
do with
housing.
agricultural
Okay.
protection.
I think we're going to have a whole separate discussion on agricultural
Okay.
protection. Right. All right. Are we ready to move on to item 2, which is to adopt a development mitigation program? I'm back to the grid. Right. Row 2 on the grid. And the, right, I mean, we all, is there any recommendation to amend any of these?
Right now, we have no recommendation to amend it. We're asking a question, and I almost hate to ask it this way, but we have a development mitigation program in place that started with Measure C, and it's been in place for quite a number of years, and it's working fairly well, as I hear. The question is that, but various elements of the county or regions of the county deal with the development fee program differently. They all seem to work. Everybody, my understanding is that people are generally happy with it, but there's extremes in this. So it's just a question at this point. We've heard it from some of the various stakeholders out there, and some of the communities in one part of the county are suggesting the other parts aren't doing it equally or fairly. We don't have a proposal. I would tell you right now, I'm not sure this is anything that's broken, so we probably don't need to deal with it, but I wanted to just ask the question of the group. And, one of the things I think
if I can just maybe move on to, the question is, does anybody believe this needs to be changed?
Okay.
Is there any other comments? Thank you. We're done. We're on to item 3. We're almost a third of the way through. And this is the one on address housing options. And this is where the issue of reporting that you have a state-approved housing element and that you provide an annual report as regarding your update comes up. And we talked about the fact that the difference between column 2 and column 3 is simply the author. So, I guess the questions here are, should we put housing element reporting into the requirements, recognizing what we already do? Commissioner Pierce.
Well, there is one more aspect in column 2. And by state law, we all have to have complete streets policies anyway. We have to have it to receive money from MTC anyway. So we are required, whenever we address a street project of any kind, to incorporate complete streets if there is capacity to do it, not just if it's feasible or we want to. If there's a way to do it, we have to do that. That's already required. And I think we're all doing that as well as we possibly can. I had a meeting this afternoon about a rural road that doesn't have the capacity for that. And there's no way, shape, or form that anybody's ever going to be able to find room on Marsh Creek Road to add a bike lane. It just isn't going to happen, people. It's not really adequate for 2 vehicles. It's current passing each other at this point. So there are going to be some local streets. There are some local streets I know where my dear friend in Orinda lives. I wouldn't ride a bike on that if it was to save my life, and I sure don't like walking on it because there's not room for 2 cars to pass, much less to have a bike in the middle of it. So there are some places where a complete street just will never happen. And to require that of everyone, in addition to what are on the MTC and the state requirements already, makes no sense. So I think we're all doing it. If we can possibly squeeze them in, we're doing it every place we possibly can. And to report out when we did our annual review of our housing element, no problem.
Except, and I agree totally with Julie on that, but we already have to report to the state our housing element, and it's...
Right, so we're okay. So
again, I get that, but it seems like we're clogging this up with stuff that we already have to do, and it's already part of a public process. I mean, if we need to do it, fine, but I'm having a real problem with having to put more stuff into this when we're already doing it, just to make some folks happy that we put it in there.
Commissioner Worth.
Yeah, I just had a suggestion. I think that when we did Measure J, we came up with there was an evolution of language. Measure C basically said you had to have a housing element. You could self-certify it. It was a static thing. With J, we added kind of an action verb saying you've got to demonstrate meaningful progress towards achieving the housing goals. And perhaps a third iteration of that might be that you quantify this effort of making progress. And I think that perhaps might be a way of articulating what cities are doing and starting to see, where we're doing the production, where cities are. So that would be maybe one suggestion that might.
And I mean, it may be as simple as saying when you had your public hearing where you went over your annual housing report.
Yeah, just putting the date down, that's it.
Commissioner Butt.
Well, I like the verbiage in option 2. I think because it adds the piece about demonstrating progress. You know, a lot of cities have a housing element. I mean, all it means is your zoning has to provide space to add housing. Doesn't mean you have to build it. And so I think that, you know, this passes my test if you're aggressively pursuing adding housing to meet your RENA requirement, then that's something that has a nexus to, you know, to the overarching goals. So I think people ought to get credit for it, and they ought to get dinged if they don't do it. By the same token, the complete streets policies, you know, I hear what you're saying about, you know, whatever it is, Marsh Creek Road or something like that. But, you know, this argument to me, it sounds a lot like the arguments people used to use about ADA and accessibility, you know. Can't do it, you know, there's no way we can widen this door to blah, blah, blah. Historic building, you know, all we're doing is paint up, fix up, you know, why do we have to make the restrooms accessible? So I think probably you could come up with some kind of a test that people are forced to address. They can't just say this is crazy, it won't work. They've got to say, okay, you know, it has to be a test. Like if you're going to spend, you know, $100,000 putting a slurry seal on a road, maybe you don't have to do it if it would cost $1 million to make part of it into a complete street. But if you're going to spend $10 million on it, and you know, you got to do it, or at least you have to spend some percentage of that on improving making the street accessible. So, you know, somebody's got to figure this out. But I think as a policy, I think the option 2 has the core of some good policies in it.
Okay. Other comments, and I'll try to.
Just one.
Commissioner Hudson.
Yeah, I'm going to start stealing your guys' line. A CCTA back to reality check. We're looking at item number 3, address housing options. How jurisdiction must adopt complete streets. I mean, address housing options, complete street. How many others think kind of off topic would we? It doesn't fit in that program.
So, right. So what I would suggest is that we include as one of the requirements that jurisdictions do what they have to do anyway, which is they have an annual report regarding their housing production, and that they notify the authority every time they fill out a 2-year checklist of when they reported. We've already put the complete streets up on the parking lot, and the problem with having a long parking lot is the first page of it gets out of view. Because I think it does warrant some conversation. You know, I think the law requires us to do complete streets at some level. I think whether the threshold is what Commissioner Butt suggested or some other one, I don't know. But I would just suggest we come back to that item and really have a more focused discussion on complete streets when we have a better understanding of what the options are.
Can we have criteria for what the current requirements are
Yes,
when
yes.
it comes back? Because
Yes.
if you haven't driven some of the roads that we've mentioned, I mean, it's a road, not a street, and what does that mean, and the capacity and how many cars go over it. So I'd like to have a better understanding of what the criteria are now for that when that issue comes back, please.
Okay, that's a good idea. And hopefully we can get that out in time so we understand what the state law is, what people are required to do. The advocates can have an opportunity to present what they would recommend we do.
Don?
Yeah, I understand that. So, but it is transportation. We may not put it in housing ultimately. Commissioner Peoples?
Yeah, I just want to comment about housing in Nexus and pick on another county. Marin County refuses to build any housing for poor people. As a result, there's a huge amount of in-traffic going back and forth from this county and from Solano back and forth into Marin. I think that housing production, and particularly housing production at all levels of affordability is an important element of a transportation plan, because if you don't have it, your chances of being able to have your workforce live in your city, I mean, cops and firefighters get paid pretty well, but your janitors and everybody else doesn't. And if you don't have affordable housing for them in your town, guess what? They're driving in from San Joaquin County or wherever they're driving in from. So I don't think there's any issue of nexus between, or a question of nexus between housing and transportation. It's there.
Okay, thank you. So one of the other things that Bill raised under the housing options, which isn't in the chart, was the issue of displacement. A suggestion might be that we allow measure funds to be used for displacement if a project sponsor wants to do that, and it's required otherwise, but that we not make displacement funding a requirement of the measure. So, for example, if you're getting money from MTC and you have to have, and to get that money you have to adopt a displacement policy, you could use sales tax measure money to help fund it. But if it's a project where you're not otherwise required to have a displacement program, then the fact that you're using measure money wouldn't require you to adopt a displacement program.
I keep saying, keep it simple.
Is that any other comments? Okay. And that, I think, was the last one there. So we are moving on to the next page.
Which is what?
This is item 4.
129? Yes.
Yeah, so this is participate in an ongoing cooperative multi-jurisdictional planning process. And the only requested change or suggested change was to prohibit the use of performance measure that use level of service or vehicle delay and replace with the vehicle miles traveled measure. And I think what Bill suggested is that we comply with state law.
Yes, that's always a good idea.
Yeah, it's always a good idea. SWAT, I think, as I recall, discussed this on Monday, and what we said was certainly we would comply with state law, but jurisdictions should retain the option of having level of service measurements for their own projects if they wanted to do both. But that's just SWAT. Other comments?
Well,
Commissioner
it's sort of,
Arnott?
I'm sorry, Noel.
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you really understand traffic modeling, level of service in many of our communities, like, for example, in Danville's community, it stops growth. It stops projects. Under the new methodology, you can build just about anything you want. So level of service is a leverage and a tool. Not that we necessarily want to stop everything, but it's an important tool. So while you think the new state law works, that's a tough standard, and you can control a project, and they can't cross that line because it's quantifiable. So be careful what you ask for. So I think leaving the level of service and that as an option while complying with state laws, absolutely.
Can you do it as an and or?
I don't think so. You still have to comply with state law.
Well, and I agree, and I guess that's my thing is there's, I think to use the word baseline, but we have to do this. If you want to do more as a city or a jurisdiction, go for it. Nobody's prohibiting you from doing more. We just don't want you to do less.
Okay. Commissioner Abelson.
Yes, when we were talking about it, when we were doing the original Measure J, we were talking about it around transit stations, because what happens around a transit station is that you expect a lot of density, including in vehicle travel. And so if you say that there can't be, a high, if your level of service is therefore going to be F, then you'll never be able to build the transit project. So this was discussed about when we discussed it then in terms of transit systems, and I think we're missing the point somehow here.
Well, I think what I was proposing is that we would comply with state law, which is going to be vehicle miles traveled. If an individual jurisdiction wanted to also use level of service or some other measure, that is their local choice.
That is not what we were saying then. What we were saying is that we don't want level of service to interfere with the development of transit stations.
Which is what state law did.
So we're okay.
So then why
State law
are we repeating it?
state law says we can't use it, so we all have to fix our action plans to take level of service out
So,
for that issue. That does not mean
Okay.
that even though you're taking it out as a region, that your city can't use it in strategic ways to further their own goals.
In
But
other places?
yes,
Okay,
but
so
we
why-
have to do it the way the state says, and
So-
that is no level of service.
well, I guess I have a hard time understanding why we need to have something in our measure that discusses something that we are required to do by state law.
That's why we're taking it out.
Okay,
Well-
so we are, oh, okay, so we are taking it out.
Well,
Okay,
we're going to
fine.
leave what state law
Thank
requires.
you.
For
Right.
non-transit-oriented development. As an example, in Danville, Alamo, the San Ramon Stone Valley Road, that's a level of service area, but it's not a transit-oriented area.
Chair
Okay,
Tatson,
fine.
maybe if I could
Yeah.
jump in a little bit, and I need some help from Martin on this one as well, but part of the discussion is that it revolves around the cooperative planning and the action plans and the level of significance that we as we analyze our action plans. So in December, we took an action relative to the countywide transportation plan, and specifically the action plans, that we would look at the effects of Senate Bill 743. Just today, OPR released proposed kind of a draft, exposure draft of guidelines. They're looking for comments by the end of February. So a lot of this is going to get clarified as these guidelines come into place. In terms of where it nets out between the discussions, as I'm hearing it from Commissioner Abelson, related to development around transit stations and PDAs, I think that's the whole purpose of the change in the statute. I don't know where it's going to net in terms of the specific actions that a local jurisdiction will be able to do with level of service. So I think that's still going to come out of the guidelines. But you can apply the local standards, whether you can make a finding of significance that would cause some other action that a council might take. That I don't know yet.
And I always wonder whether it's similar to, cities have design review findings. There's no underlying state law per se. So could a city comply with the VMT requirements in the EIR, but then also look at whether the project's impact on level of service was, and that could be a general plan or a specific plan guideline. That requires a
Right.
finding for approval.
Right, I think that's correct. It's just whether you can use it as a level of significance in your CEQA document.
I expect you probably
Well, I
can.
know that's prohibited, yeah.
Right. Commissioner Peoples?
Yeah, this is probably a lot more granular than rises to the level of this body. But I know AC Transit has commented extensively on this CEQA change. And for bus transit agencies, level of service really is very important, because delays in travel time means additional costs, et cetera, et cetera. So you really have to get in on an individual project level and look at things like queue jump lanes, like priority lights and all that stuff, so that when your LOS goes up, you can buffer the bus transit from that. But as I say, I think that's more granular than you deal with at this level. But it should be the sort of thing that comes up with individual projects if there's enough bus service to worry about.
Okay. Thank you. So I think, what have you written? Right, comply with state law, we agree with that. Yeah, and local policies where they're not in conflict with
Right.
state law.
Yeah, I think maybe one way we may want to capture it is that we have the existing language in Measure J, and as the guidelines come out, which hopefully happens within the timeline of we're putting this together, that we can amend the language to be consistent with the law and what's in the guidelines. I don't know that we can commit to any more than that right now, because we haven't seen it.
Okay. So I want to go back for a moment, because on the housing element, Bill had mentioned something that I forgot to cover, which was just like we have a TLC program in the current measure. The suggestion was to have an additional TLC-like measure in a new program, perhaps with some enhanced or modified qualifications for infill to incentivize infill development. Is that?
But that's not a checklist item.
No, but he had put it here, so.
Well, we're trying to be responsive to the inputs we've gotten from a variety of folks. They proposed, one proposal was a separate category to fund infill housing or fund incentives for infill housing. We believe that the purpose and the spirit behind your TLC program when you established it in 2004 with Measure J was just that. In fact, if you look at a lot of your overarching goals and objectives, it is to encourage infill development. So what we're thinking, and I want to characterize all of this, we're looking for the input we're getting. We're getting good input, obviously, but the concept here is to augment the current TLC program with additional dollars in the new measure. That's very important because that's consistent with your overarching goals. The additional thought we have is to add some additional either guidelines or requirements in the TLC to get the TLC funds based on a community's progress or lack of progress in housing, for example. Now, we don't have a specific proposal today, and I think I've already gotten the input that is you're generally open to those if there's justification for it. If there's not, I think we got the feeling we better find areas that there's consensus. But I think there's a lot of consensus within the business, the development community, and the environmental community that finding ways to incentivize infill and make it easier for projects to get approved and funded in higher densities in the urban areas of the various communities, all the communities, not just the PDAs, but all the communities. Find a way to reward that process, and so that's good public policy. I think that's the direction we're going, unless your board says, look, we like the current program as it is, we don't need to change it, and we don't need any more money in it. I think we think it ought to be augmented, the current program.
So are people comfortable with suggestions for some augmentation, recognizing the details on the augmentation have to come back to us? Yeah. Okay. Any other comment on that topic? Commissioner Hudson?
Yeah, are you thinking along the lines of the RTPCs? Like last time, I think West County was high on the TLC. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how we'd use it. I can't get the business park to go for any money. So, I mean, are you thinking along the lines of the RTPC, or am I putting words in your mouth?
Certainly the RTPCs have a big role in deciding what they would like to fund.
Yeah, and I'd like to comment, all RTPCs did request a certain amount of funding for the TLC program. So, this is one of those areas where you could have a base amount, and through this regional choice, you could bump it up if you want.
Okay, so item 5 was the urban limit line, and that's already on the parking lot. So I suggest we've asked for more information, and unless people have more information they'd like in addition to what we already requested, we not continue that discussion tonight. The other component of that was I think we need some clarification both from the advocates and from staff regarding what they meant about limiting essentially utility services outside the urban limit line. Because as Mr. Gray mentioned, a lot of those are controlled by special districts rather than by cities, and as an authority we have no control over the special districts. So I think maybe we need to see some more detail on what that proposal is when it comes back to us.
Well, we're basically going to recommend status quo. There is no way to do it. We've already talked and conveyed this to the proponents of this, and I think, I'm not going to commit to knowing what their position is, but I think on this particular issue, they understand that there's really no ability for your authority, even if you wanted to incentivize or disincentivize a special district. So I think it's kind of a moot point at this point. It's an informational item. What we're trying to do is be responsive to all the requests, and that's been the attempt here.
Thank you. I think we can bring it up at another meeting. And you notice items 5 and 6, there are no suggested changes to what we currently do, a 5-year capital program and a transportation systems management ordinance. So that's 6 and 7, excuse me, 6 and 7, right. So we are through that list, recognizing we'll come back to a few items. Would people like to end now, or would you like to have a few minutes of essentially putting our toe in the water about return to source formulas for a new measure?
Yeah.
I think I heard a vote for ending.
How about actually just have a, if we only have 10 minutes, talk about what are we going to accomplish at our next meeting, so we're looking forward, so we're
Yeah, so why don't you, so we go back
accustomed here.
To the, Ross, to the slide you had, I think that's in our packet, about the several items. Well, if you look in the handout, it's
also in the handout.
It's not a page number.
It's on the last.
It's on the last page of your handout.
Or no?
No, it's not the last
No,
page.
it's like a middle page.
It's about in the middle. It's called Development of Potential Transportation
Page
Expenditure
5.
Plan.
It's in front of the community vision.
Right.
Or behind the urban limit line.
Right, so page 5 says,
No.
no, that's what we're saying, it's page 5, at least as I counted them. No, it's in the handout this evening.
No, keep going.
So I think clearly one is
There we
the discard, return to source discussion. And I think that will encompass then funding for things like augmented transportation for livable community strategy, maybe a complete streets component, things like that. So we can look at all of those. Well, and I would sort of, I think that if we can get a report back on the urban limit line, and then I would ask staff to suggest which ones they think will be ready, where they will have proposals for us.
So this would be for
February 3rd.
2 weeks. We might be able to have a discussion on where we are with the advanced mitigation program.
Okay.
We haven't had a discussion necessarily with our stakeholder group, but I've been involved in a program that's sponsored by AMTC and kind of somewhat modeled after Sandag and other successful efforts. So we at least talk about where we are, just as an information item.
And Commissioner Pierce suggests you'd also update us regarding the results of the EPAC meeting.
Yes.
That should be good. Commissioner Hudson?
The EPAC, one of the things that I'm focused on is their urban limit line request says eliminate it and or reduce it to what? When you get to what do they want? I mean, that's really the thing we're talking about. What do you want?
I think we have that as an action item to work with the proponents of that to put some more rationale, I think is a term that Commissioner Arnott used, and Commissioner Mitchoff. We need to, we'll bring back we'll work with the group to bring back some more information about what they're seeing in terms of some of the pressures that Joel's described, and then some of the rationale for some of the changes.
Okay. So we should probably expect to have some presentations made by some of our groups that advise us, in addition to a staff presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Are there items for the next special meeting agenda, Commissioner Arnerich?
One that I think it's really important, it's an easy one to do. I think this agency's better than most at doing it, is been on accountability measures, taxpayer protections. Maybe have staff look at what do we do? Is there any area that we think we want to change and do that? I think this agency does really good. It does most of the things that have been listed. But I think that's when we got to get out of the way and have it up front, because we're here trying to divide a pie up versus I think we want to make sure that those accountability measures guide us in everything that we're doing too. So
Okay.
if that's something.
I think we filled the next agenda.
And if I might offer a counter proposal on that one, that's one we discussed a little bit with some of the city managers yesterday. If you could give us 2 meetings for that, I think.
Okay.
We want to bring. We don't want to repeat what we're doing here. Is just bringing you what we heard without talking to some of the other stakeholders, and with the timeline a meeting in 2 weeks means we need to mail it out to you in about a week.
All right, thank you. So with that, there's the calendar, which surprisingly is not different from the calendar we looked at in the regular authority meeting. And I apologize to everyone for being a bit pushy this evening. But we got through at least a component. So we are adjourned to our special meeting on February 3rd.
But Don, I do want to get on the agenda at some point, a presentation by all of my bus agencies.